There comes a point in life when you stop arguing about who is right or wrong, stop explaining, and stop holding on. For Libra, this is the moment you pause, not because the feelings are gone, but because you understand deeply how much you have already given. You don't leave in anger. You leave in a very quiet kind of calm when your heart no longer needs to prove that it deserves to stay. And in that exact moment, when you choose to let go instead of enduring a little longer, something subtle begins to move. No one notices it right away, but everything is no longer standing still. In this video, we step into that moment of release for Libra and the way destiny quietly begins to shift through the silence you chose. There are seasons in life when you no longer have the energy to keep trying the way you once did. Not because life has become worse, but because your heart has already traveled too far. For Libra, this moment usually arrives quietly. No warning, no script. Just one morning you wake up and realize you no longer want to explain anything. You no longer feel the need to prove that you loved enough. You no longer want to keep the balance by leaning entirely toward endurance. Libra has always been someone who listens, someone who adjusts so everything can feel more harmonious, someone who stays silent when their emotions might make others uncomfortable. But at some point, that silence stops being a sacrifice. It becomes a boundary so light, so thin, yet so clear that even you are surprised to realize you crossed to the other side without noticing when. That is what letting go without tears feels like. It is no longer painful enough to cry, no longer angry enough to react, just a strange emptiness where you sit still and finally understand that you have done all you could. You remember all the times you tried to say enough, tried to stay in the right way, tried to be patient a little longer, hoping everything would balance itself again. But instead of feeling lighter, you felt more tired. Not tired of others, but tired of yourself for holding everything together just to keep it from moving. At this stage, Libra stops looking for answers outside. You no longer ask who is right or wrong. You no longer ask whether you should try again. You simply observe your own emotions, the way your body responds, the quiet evenings that last a little longer than before. And somewhere in that observation, you begin to understand that love does not always need more effort. Sometimes it needs a pause. Letting go here does not look like giving up. It feels more like putting down a suitcase you have carried for too long, not because it was unimportant, but because your hands are tired. You do not blame yourself for trying. You do not blame others for not understanding. You simply admit that you cannot continue the same way without losing yourself. What is unique about Libra is that this moment of release does not make you cold. It softens you. Emotions slow down. Breathing becomes deeper. You begin to hear your inner voice more clearly, the one that had been drowned out for so long by the need to please everyone. And in that quiet, you realize that having no tears does not mean you feel nothing. It only means you have been through enough to no longer need to prove your pain. Maybe no one around you notices this moment. Maybe the world continues exactly as before. But for Libra, this is a very real turning point. The point where you stop convincing yourself to stay. Stop asking whether trying a little longer would change anything. You do not know what comes next, and you do not need to know yet. It is enough to understand that this letting go does not come from weakness, but from a very quiet kind of maturity. And perhaps sometimes in life, the most human thing we can do for ourselves is to accept that we have loved enough, endured enough, and that it is time to let the heart rest without asking permission from anyone. For a very long time, Libra often carries a familiar belief that leaving means losing. That if you walk away from a relationship, a role, or an expectation, it must mean you are not patient enough, not understanding enough, or simply not good enough to hold everything together. That thought is never loud, but it holds on tightly. It keeps you staying longer than you should, just so you do not have to face the feeling of being the one who gave up. But eventually, that way of seeing things begins to shift. Not because someone convinces you, but because your own experience starts to speak. You begin to notice that some efforts do not make things better. They only wear you down slowly. Some attempts no longer build anything. They quietly turn into a very subtle form of self-harm. And when you see this clearly, Libra starts to understand that leaving is not always a loss. In many cases, letting go is simply knowing when to stop. It is realizing that you have moved too far away from your own center just to keep everything balanced. You do not leave by denying what once existed. You do not leave to prove anything to anyone. You leave because you understand that staying longer would require you to trade away important parts of yourself. Libra has a natural tendency to negotiate with destiny. You ask yourself if you can adjust a little more, if you can endure a little longer so nothing falls apart, if doing something differently might change the ending. But at this stage, you begin to stop those negotiations, not because you feel hopeless, but because you see clearly that some scales have been off for too long and cannot be balanced through one-sided sacrifice. Letting go does not feel like victory. It does not feel like defeat either. It feels like a very clear acceptance. You accept that not everything needs to be held at all costs. You accept that sometimes the greatest compassion you can offer yourself is to stop forcing yourself to remain in situations that make you smaller every day. What is interesting is that when Libra stops seeing leaving as a failure, you begin to notice things you once overlooked. You feel a sense of lightness enter the spaces that were once filled with responsibility and expectation. You find more room to breathe, to think, to feel, without constantly adjusting your emotions to keep others comfortable. And you realize that your value does not decrease just because you no longer stay where you no longer belong. At this point, Libra no longer needs to prove that the choice was right. You do not need validation from anyone else. You only need honesty with yourself. The honesty that says if you continue, you will pay a price your heart is no longer willing to carry. And when you stop from that place of honesty, letting go no longer resembles failure. It becomes a very quiet act of self-respect. There may still be moments when you wonder if you left too soon, if you should have tried a little longer. Those questions are natural. But deep inside, you know this decision did not come from impulse. It came from a long process of observing, enduring, and finally understanding. And perhaps in Libra's journey of maturity, the courage to walk away when necessary is not a sign of weakness, but a form of strength that is calm, steady, and strong enough to protect yourself. There is something Libra often only realizes after finally stopping, that silence does not always mean standing still. Before this, you may have believed that if you did not speak up, did not respond, did not clarify everything, the story would remain stuck right where it was. You were used to keeping things moving through conversation, through explanation, through your steady presence. But eventually you choose silence not because you have nothing left to say, but because you no longer want to participate in the same old cycle. When Libra stops reacting, a space begins to open. At first, that space can feel unfamiliar. There are no messages that need an immediate reply. No conversations that must be maintained just to keep the peace. No repeated explanations offered in the hope that someone will finally understand. And yet, inside that space, you begin to notice something subtle. Things around you do not disappear because you are silent. Instead, they begin to reveal their true nature. Libra's silence is not a form of punishment. It is not meant to make anyone feel guilty or deprived. It is simply a withdrawal from dynamics that are no longer healthy. And when you withdraw, forces that were once hidden by your constant effort begin to move on their own. Those who relied on your presence to maintain balance now have to face their share of responsibility. Situations that existed because of your patience begin to change their shape. This does not happen quickly. It does not arrive as a dramatic moment. It moves like water beneath the surface, quiet, patient, but steady enough to shift the foundation. Libra does not need to do anything more than continue holding that silence. Not silence as avoidance, but silence as observation. Watching how things operate when you are no longer the support holding them up. You may begin to notice that some relationships loosen. Some situations can no longer keep their old form. And you may see that things once believed to be solid cannot stand without your constant adjustment. These realizations are not meant to make you feel superior or disappointed. They are simply information. Information that helps you understand how significant your role once was and how much movement your absence actually creates. Destiny, if we choose to call it that, rarely shifts through obvious signs. It does not need declarations. It does not need dramatic turning points. Sometimes, it only requires one person to stop participating in an outdated script. Libra's silence does not cause the world to collapse, but it is enough to change the rhythm. Enough for what no longer fits to fall away on its own. Enough for truths that were long delayed to finally surface. Within that silence, Libra also begins to feel themselves more clearly. You hear your thoughts more distinctly. You recognize which emotions are truly yours, and which were shaped by obligation. And slowly, you come to understand that action is not always the only way to create change. Sometimes, not continuing as before is already a powerful movement. No one can say for certain where silence will lead. But perhaps the most important thing is not the outcome. It is the fact that you chose not to betray your own inner knowing anymore. And from that moment, very slowly, very gently, a new current begins to form. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to guide everything in a different direction, one where you no longer have to trade your inner peace just to keep the world around you in balance. When Libra is no longer there to keep enduring, something unusual begins to happen. Not right away, and not in a way that is easy to notice. Small gaps begin to appear in places where your presence once filled the space. And it is those gaps that make people who grew used to your gentleness, your patience, your willingness to yield, start to feel the absence of something they never had to think about before. Those who once took you lightly may never say it out loud. They may never admit it, but your silence forces them to face a new reality. The reality that things once ran smoothly in part because you were quietly adjusting, stepping back, carrying more weight than you should have. When you stop doing that, the familiar rhythm begins to slip. Not because you intend to disrupt anything, but because the system itself was never as stable as it appeared to be. Situations that once made you feel confined begin to show small cracks. Perhaps an imbalance that was long hidden by your patience. Perhaps an issue that existed for years but was never confronted because you were always the one holding everything together. When Libra withdraws, those coverings slowly fall away. No noise, no judgment. Just truth revealing itself in the most natural way. What matters is that you do not need to do anything for this to happen. You do not need to prove anything. You do not need to explain. You do not need to return to fix what was never yours to carry. Simply no longer being there to endure is enough to create change. Your absence is not punishment. It is simply the consequence of choosing to protect yourself. And sometimes, that very choice is what causes the things that once held power over you to slowly lose their influence. Libra can feel this shift clearly inside. You are no longer pulled into familiar emotional patterns. You no longer react the way you once did. Words that used to hurt now sound softer. Situations that once tightened your chest no longer reach you in the same way. not because you have become cold, but because you have moved your inner position. You are no longer standing in the place where you are most vulnerable. At this stage, Libra may begin to see a deeply human truth. Not everyone hurts you on purpose. Sometimes they hurt you because you allowed it for too long. And when you stop allowing it, the balance shifts naturally. No confrontation, no winners or losers. Just an old order that can no longer hold its original shape. This loss of power does not come from being stronger than others. It comes from no longer placing your worth in other people's hands. When you stop seeking validation from places that once wounded you, those places naturally lose their ability to affect you. And in a very gentle way, that gives back to you the authority over yourself that you once handed away without realizing it. Libra does not need to celebrate this change. You do not need to mourn it either. You only need to recognize that you are entering a different phase. One where you are no longer the point that absorbs the pressure of what is out of balance. What once hurt you does not disappear immediately, but it no longer sits at the center of your emotional life. And sometimes, that alone is enough to help you keep walking. More lightly, more slowly, but with greater steadiness on your own path. When Libra no longer tries to keep the peace by sacrificing themselves, a very different state begins to form. It does not arrive as excitement or victory. It comes quietly, like water settling after a long wave finally passes. You no longer feel the need to tense yourself to keep everything stable. You no longer carry the fear that if you let go, everything will fall apart. What replaces it is a deeper calm, not because every problem has disappeared, but because you are finally standing in the right place within yourself. This state does not make Libra distant. If anything, it allows you to be more present. You begin to sense your boundaries naturally, without having to construct them through logic. You know when to listen and when to stop. There is no longer an automatic reflex to give in just to avoid conflict. No lingering guilt when you say no. Your responses slow down, but they grow steadier. As if somewhere inside, you have found a stable axis again, one that had been misaligned for far too long. In this new balance, Libra no longer lives to maintain the image of harmony on the outside. You begin to understand that true harmony cannot exist if there is constant unrest within. And when you allow yourself to prioritize inner steadiness, the relationships and situations around you begin to adjust on their own, not because you control them, but because you no longer bend yourself to fit what no longer fits you. You may notice that you no longer need to say much to be understood. You no longer feel compelled to prove your worth through endless patience. Your presence becomes cleaner, clearer. Others can sense the change, even if they cannot name it. Some see that you have changed. Some feel that you are more distant. But it no longer shakes you the way it once did, because you are no longer trading your balance for acceptance. In this new equilibrium, Libra begins to return everything to its proper place. Other people's emotions no longer rest on your shoulders. Your responsibility no longer includes repairing what you did not break. You still care. You are still kind. But you no longer dissolve yourself into someone else's story. You keep just enough distance to preserve connection, without losing yourself. What stands out most is that Libra's strength now does not come from doing more. It comes from doing less, but doing what is right. You choose response over reaction. You choose to listen to yourself before listening to the world. And from that choice, a sense of inner safety begins to grow. Not safety because everything is certain, but because you trust that you can remain steady even when things change. This new balance is not a fixed destination. It is a living state, one that can shift, one that may need adjustment over time. But unlike before, Libra is no longer afraid of adjusting. You know that as long as your inner axis remains strong, external changes will not easily throw you off course. And that understanding itself brings a calm that is quietly powerful. No display, no proof required. Perhaps for Libra, this is the phase where life begins to slow down in a very real way. You no longer rush to find answers for everything. You allow things to unfold in their own rhythm. And in that slowness, you come to see that balance does not mean the absence of turbulence, but the ability to keep your direction, even when the surface is not perfectly still. When Libra steps out of the old balance and stands firmly within a new inner axis, something very subtle begins to unfold. There are no warning signs, no dramatic moment you can point to. You simply start to realize that you are no longer standing in the same place as before, even though the world around you may look exactly the same. This change does not need an announcement, because it was never meant to be seen by others. It was meant to be felt by you. Leaving at the right moment is not an act of defying fate. It is more like stepping out of the way of the current. When you stop trying to hold things together, stop trying to fix, stop trying to carry what is not yours, what needs to move finds its own path forward. Destiny, if we choose to call it that, rarely turns through grand decisions. It shifts through choices that are small, quiet, and deeply honest. And choosing not to keep hurting yourself is one of those choices. Libra does not need to know where everything is going. You do not need to believe that everything will get better. What matters more is that you are no longer resisting your deepest inner knowing. When you stop forcing yourself to fit into what has already gone out of alignment, the energy you once used to endure is released. It does not disappear. It simply changes direction. And from that redirection, new possibilities, new connections, or sometimes a completely different way of living begin to have space to form. This turning point often happens in silence. There is no applause, no confirmation. But you begin to notice it in very ordinary moments, in the way you are no longer pulled into old emotional patterns, in the way your responses become slower, deeper, in the way you no longer feel the need to go back and prove that you were right. What once unsettled you now passes through without taking root. And that is how you know you have stepped into a different rhythm of life. At this stage, Libra does not need to brace themselves to appear strong. Your strength lies in the fact that you no longer question whether you should return. You no longer weigh staying to keep the peace against leaving to protect yourself. The scale has adjusted itself, and once it returns to its true axis, the next choices become clearer, even if you cannot name them yet. Some people may notice your change after some time. They may look back and understand something they did not before, or they may not. But that is no longer the center of the story. The story now belongs to you, to the way you walk more lightly, to the way you move forward without paying for it with your inner peace. A quiet shift in destiny is not a promise that life will be easy. It is simply a change in direction. And sometimes, changing direction alone is enough to place you on a completely different path. Not faster, not farther. Just more aligned with who you are becoming. Looking back, Libra may not remember the exact moment everything changed. You only remember that there was a time you chose to let go without making it a scene. And from that very ordinary moment, life slowly stopped feeling the same. Not because of a miracle, but because you no longer remained in a role that was wearing you down. And perhaps this is the most beautiful ending to this journey. Not a closed ending, but an opening. An opening where Libra continues to live, to feel, to move forward in their own rhythm. No proving, no rushing, just honesty with yourself. Because sometimes the greatest change in life does not come from trying harder, but from the moment you become quiet enough to let go at exactly the right time.